Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started now. So thank you everybody for joining us today. My name is Kelly McDonald with Detail Roofing, and joining me today for the period at the end is Michelle Wallace-Carswell, our Business Development Manager. So just so everybody knows, after the presentation, we will be having an open forum Q&A. However, if at any point during the presentation you do have a question that you don't want to forget, please feel free to pose it in the chat and we will get around to it at the end. Okay, so to get started, I'm sure everybody here has their fair share of experience dealing with roof leaks or any sort of leak. So what we wanted to do is just compile all of the data from the leaks that we investigated throughout 2022 so that we could determine what the most common causes of leaks were and see if there's anything, any tips or tricks to help try and prevent leak issues in the future. Unfortunately, leaks can't be eliminated entirely. They can be very unpredictable and very tricky to track and trace. However, we just want to provide as much information as possible to try and stop as many leaks in their tracks as you can. So what we're going to be taking a look at is the broad range of topics and causes. Within those categories, we'll look at more specific examples of the particular leak issues that we saw, and once again, determine if there are any steps that can be taken to try and prevent some leak issues. So the number one leak cause that we ran into last year at 31% was membrane or shingle damages and deterioration. So when we're talking about any damage or deterioration to the field and stripping membrane for flat roofs or damage and deterioration to the shingles, we're talking about anything related to aging or any natural damages that can be caused from weather events, animals, or loose objects. So in a lot of these cases, the things that we saw were not necessarily widespread to the point that a roof replacement was recommended. In a lot of these cases, it was smaller defects where localized repairs were ultimately recommended. But again, that's going to depend on the specific situation. As far as some of the most common roof systems that we ran into, single ply roof system that could include either TPO, EPDM, vinyl, or PVC. 61% of the leaks that we investigated with single ply roof systems were related to membrane damages and defects. With tar and gravel roof systems, that was 42%. With inverted roof system, regardless of the type of membrane, that was 35%. Shingle roof systems, 23, and two-ply SBS, 22. So with single-ply systems, we tend to see these not as often on residential condos. We do see it more commonly on commercial facilities, and if it is in a residential condo, we tend to see it more often on canopies or unit terraces, not so much on the main roof surfaces. This roof system in particular can be very easily penetrated. So that's part of the reason why a lot of the leaks that we investigate on this type of roof, a lot of them come from the membrane, just because it is punctured very easily, can lead to a lot of leak issues. So in this case here, we do have quite a large puncture in the membrane. And as you can see in the areas surrounding, there have been many leak issues here before and many patches done. It's not often that we're seeing punctures and holes that are this big. A lot of the times they are very small little holes in the membrane. It can be very hard to detect if you're just completing a walk through the roof surface. And again, on residential units, especially because we're seeing these often on canopies or some lower roof surfaces, things like any debris falling off of balconies, or especially if anybody is throwing any debris or cigarette butts from their balconies and landing on these lower roof surfaces, we can see widespread leaks throughout the different roof systems. So again, because this roof system is exposed, and if you're completing a walkthrough, you can detect some of these damages. We would recommend just having regular inspections completed to determine if anything can be found, or if you're having maintenance completed on these type of roof systems, ensuring that part of the scope does allow for inspecting and repairing any small damages that are observed before they turn into a leak issue. With tar and gravel or built-up roofing, this is an older system. We don't commonly see this installed on newer buildings anymore. The system that has sort of replaced this in flat roofing would be 2-ply SBS or modified bitumen membrane. So because of the fact that this is an older system, a lot of the times when we're encountering it, it is on an older building. The roof itself is aging. So a lot of deterioration present, and this membrane in particular is more prone to major splits and cracks from things like natural building movement or weather fluctuations that we experience this time of year, where it's going from freezing cold temperatures to milder temperatures. That can really add a lot of stress on the roof system. This building in particular is a commercial facility that we work on. We've done a lot of work over the years doing either leak repairs or installing new equipment for penetrations that they have. We were working not far outside of this area within the last couple of years. We had spudded and exposed a big section of the membrane. There weren't any defects apparent. And over this past winter, there was a pretty sizable crack that came about, again, likely due to temperature fluctuations. So inverted or green roof systems can be really tricky when it comes to identifying leak issues, especially when the leak issues are related to the membrane, just because the membrane layer is not visible when you are walking the roof surface, and to expose that membrane, you have to remove the various layers of the roof system. So with an inverted roof, that's either going to be gravel, ballast, and paving stones, filter cloth, and insulation. With a green roof system, you have all of those, as well as additional layers of the actual greenery and drainage layers. So, when we're investigating something, again, tracing it out based on the interior leak area will give you your best chance of a starting point. And from there, if there aren't any obvious defects, then you would have to expose further areas. You can do membrane cut tests to determine if there is any water present beneath the membrane and try to trace out that path of water. So in these cases here, we have one cause that's coming from the field membrane, the flat part, and one from the stripping membrane, which is the upturn. So in both cases, the membrane was a liquid rubber membrane, in both cases heavily deteriorated. In this top one here, when a cut test was performed, water just started seeping out of the membrane. And our technicians did note that when you were in this area, you could feel the water beneath the membrane when you were walking. In this one here, there were some signs that something was going on here. There was some rust forming along the metal flashing and the caulking. When that was all removed, again, the membrane underneath was severely deteriorated and split and cracked where water was entering. With shingled roof surfaces, probably quite obvious. The most common things that we see are either severe deterioration, where the shingles have become really brittle and cracked and water is getting through, or cases where, whether it's due to wind damages or other weather events, shingles have become missing and damaged. And in a lot of cases, we do see exposed plywood where these shingles have become damaged. Usually with any defects with the shingles, they are pretty easy to spot and are reported quite quickly. However, sometimes depending on the height and slope of the roof, you may not be able to see the exact extent of shingle damages. It might not be safe to access the area right away, especially on days like today where there is a lot of snow and ice built up from the storm we experienced yesterday. But whenever possible, if there are any defects to the shingles, we do recommend getting those addressed as soon as possible. One thing that should help moving forward with any new shingle installations for the whole roof or new developments entirely, these types of shingles here, 3-tab shingles, have been discontinued in Ontario. Although they look quite nice, they are susceptible to wind damages. The wind just comes and picks up underneath, causing the shingles to fly off. So the other types of shingles that are available on the market right now are a little more durable, especially standing against wind and other severe weather events. So the other major shingle issue that we see this particular time of year is related to the lowest point of the roof where the shingles are meeting the gutter or eaves trough, and related to any ice damming or ice and snow built up in those areas. So what we see, even if the rest of the roof is in really great condition, is when that snow and ice is built up, it's getting in under that bottom shingle layer, past the gutter and getting into the plywood roof deck there. So in this case, what could be recommended is installing metal flashing that's going to go behind the gutter and underneath the roof shingles, just to try and stop water from getting underneath the shingles there and diverting it back into the gutter. So next up, with 15% of the overall leaks that we saw last year was related to metal seams. So what we're talking about when we say the metal seams, that's either situations where at the metal flashing seams, whether it's the wall flashing or the cap flashing or any other metal details, if the seams are open and exposed due to missing or deteriorated caulking, or any occurrences where the metal has become disconnected and is lifting at the seams. It's not very often that we run into situations where a leak is occurring because of a section of metal flashing missing entirely, just because a lot of managers are very diligent about reporting that right away, just because it is very easy to spot and can be such a huge safety hazard that somebody's out and addressing that right away. These things can be a little more difficult to spot, especially if it's just lifting very slightly and you're not accessing the roof very often, or with caulking. There's so many different areas throughout the roof surface and the building in general that do require or could benefit from caulking. So, just making sure that is monitored on a regular basis, so it's not getting to the point that it's so deteriorated that there's splits and cracks happening throughout the caulking. In a lot of cases, we do find that there isn't any sort of waterproofing layer beneath metal, more so on cap flashing. Mostly on cap flashing. However, even if there is waterproofing present, we do still run into issues from time to time. So some of the specific cases that we saw from last year, metal on the parapet wall, the caulking was deteriorated along the metal seam. When the metal was removed to investigate what was going on beneath, there was a waterproofing membrane there. Water was sitting on top of it, but the main issue was that next to this parapet wall, there was a sloped metal cladding roof area where the water was traveling down. All the insulation in this area was soaked, and it did appear that the water was traveling down here and not related to anything on the parapet wall and going through that section. Another thing that we see quite commonly with concrete balconies on towers is deteriorated caulking or issues with the caulking along the transitions, which then we see the water coming back into the unit and either causing damage to the baseboards or the flooring within the unit. In this particular case, the caulking didn't appear to be overly deteriorated. However, it did seem to be, there was an issue with the adhesion of the caulking. So water was entering beneath it. When this section of caulking was removed, the whole area behind was wet and full of water, which was backing into the unit. So again, sometimes even if caulking or waterproofing are in place, doesn't mean that it's necessarily sufficient. So at this particular case with a chiller unit, there was a combination of areas where you could see new caulking, There was a section where the caulking did appear to be slightly deteriorated, but not to the point where there were any splits or cracks or any immediate concerns. And then there was an area where along the metal seam, there wasn't any caulking at all, and there was an opening for water to enter. When the sections of metal were removed, there was a waterproofing underlayment beneath there. However, there were some defects with the waterproofing and some openings present along the top and in one of the sides where water did appear to be getting in. So again, because the waterproofing can either be at a point where it's deteriorating and needing to be replaced, or in a lot of cases isn't there at all, ensuring that caulking is renewed regularly and not getting to the point where it is deteriorated or that any metal seams are sealed so that water can't enter, definitely something to stay on top of. In this case here, another situation where caulking was deteriorated. In this case, it wasn't affecting an interior area. This was a front canopy, so still an issue as the water was dropping down on people entering the building below. But this is just a reminder that if you are having inspections completed on the roof, you want to ensure that it's not just the main roof surface at the top of the building, but any other roof surfaces throughout, whether that is the front entrance canopy, any lower terraces, any garage roof areas, just to ensure that any areas that may require attention are being reported and that attention is being focused on those areas. So 14% of the leaks that we looked at last year were actually not related to roofing or attics, but they were situations where another trade was required to ultimately address the leak issue. So in these cases, we had completed an investigation, traced out what was happening, and found that it was either a situation that required a plumber, an HVAC technician, a window glazier, or a building envelope specialist. These ones can be a little tricky because there are several cases where, when the leak is occurring, you're not sure. It could be roofing, it could be plumbing, it could be a variety of different things. So in this particular case that we have here, right above this area is the attic and then the roof surface. So it very likely could have been coming from the roof. When we completed the investigation, there wasn't any staining present on the roof deck or any of the penetrations from the roof surface. So it didn't appear to be coming from the roof. And then throughout the investigation, there was a pipe that was found that did have a small split in it, and water was coming out of that pipe and then saturating the insulation below. So in that case, we were the first people to investigate the issue. A plumber was recommended, and ultimately they were the one to deal with the issue. There are some cases though where it turns into a little bit of a back and forth because property manager did suspect that it was another issue, but a contractor came out, took a look at it and said, nope, it's a roofing issue. So in these cases, we always recommend that, again, a thorough investigation is completed. There are times where we might have to cut the drywall, be investigating behind the ceiling, behind the walls, whatever it takes to trace out the source of the water. There are also cases where, just to make it easier and so that there's not a back and forth, we might complete an investigation in conjunction with another trade, or do water testing just to kind of rule out any additional issues. So in one case that we experienced at the end of last year, in this particular investigation, there were also some issues happening on the roof above this unit with a plumbing stack that was connected to the unit. There were some damages present on the high dome of the plumbing stack, so that was replaced. However, ultimately during the investigation, there was water staining and damages present to the baseboard in the kitchen, as well as the bedroom adjacent to the kitchen area. The dishwasher that was here, when it was removed to just take a look behind, there was some water built up behind that dishwasher. We ended up accessing the bedroom adjacent that was also experiencing some damages to the baseboards, and cut the drywall so that we could see what was happening between those two walls. When the drywall was cut and that area was investigated, there was quite a buildup of water found on the concrete on the kitchen wall side. As well, the plumbing stack, the connection from the roof was found. And although there was some staining present from that area, it did appear to be older and not anything that had been actively leaking recently. Again, just water throughout, and then ultimately it was found that there was active water leaking from the dishwasher, and a plumber was recommended to come in and take a look at that. So 11% of the overall investigations that we completed last year were related to improper installation. So in these cases, it was either from a localized repair that had some issues with the installation, or just a new roof replacement that had some issues. So some considerations to make when completing any sort of roofing repair do include the manufacturer installation guidelines and technical data sheets, surface preparation for the area that is being repaired or for the installation area, product compatibility, and measurements. So in this case, it's not something where, you can follow the installation guidelines and technical data sheets and you're good to go. It has to be all of these working together. If there's one thing that's missed or one thing that's overlooked, it can ultimately impact the overall integrity of the repair or the installation. So when these steps are not followed, what that may look like is corners being cut and new membrane not being installed to the manufacturer guidelines, or not following the technical data sheets that have information on what you need to do to prepare the surfaces, storage temperatures, installation temperatures, application methods for mixing various components, and other information like that. When some of these steps aren't followed, it could look like the membrane not being adequately bonded and starting to lift at the seams or just lift up entirely. This can happen very shortly after the installation is completed. It's not something that necessarily happens years later. When incompatible products are used, again, you're going to see an issue with the overall adhesion of the products, and either very shortly after or over time, those products will start to lift and create openings because they're not meant to work together. As far as the measurements go, that relates to incorrectly sized hardware. You'll see some photos in a moment. We do see a lot of cases where somebody is installing either flashing for a penetration or something to seal a penetration or cap something off, and it just looks like they use something that they have on hand rather than something that's actually going to fit the area. And again, it does create openings and gaps where water can get in. So just some examples of the issues that we normally see. This is also something that we see most commonly with the installation of 2-ply SBS membrane systems. So again, if these are not installed properly, whether it's a torch-on membrane or a self-adhered 2-ply membrane, if the steps are not followed, then you're going to see lifting in the seams throughout where water can get underneath, ridging and blistering throughout the membrane, especially in widespread cases like this. And then something that we see very commonly are issues with the stripping or flashing membrane that's going to go up any parapet walls or up any penetrations that are installed throughout the roof surface. So in this particular case here, the membrane didn't go all the way up and over the parapet wall, and there was no additional waterproofing there. So there was a pretty fair stretch that was exposed, just bare plywood that was there, allowing water to get in and enter. And as I was just mentioning, when it comes to the hardware being used, whether it is the flashing for vent penetrations, the storm collars, or anything else for various penetrations, if it's not the correct size, you're going to see issues. So in some cases here, the tall cone that's used here is a little bit too big. They tried to make it work, but ultimately openings here where water can get in, and there's not anything there, whether it's sealant or a storm collar, to even attempt to divert the water from this area. In this case, again, tall cone at this vent, way too big. They did install a storm collar. However, the penetration or the flashing is so big that even the storm collar doesn't cover it. And again, you have a little gap there where water is entering. In two cases here, we have high domes at plumbing stacks that are too large. And even if something was tried to put over it, again, there's just too much space there where water is going to be able to enter. Similarly with this one here, that's too large. There was a storm collar. However, it was sitting on a bit of an angle when we did access the roof area. And from the interior investigation, you could see daylight coming through from this opening here. This particular one here, not only was there not sealant at the top, but there was also an opening underneath where maybe not water like from active rainfall, but if there was any snow buildup here, it could get in from the opening. This is also something that would be used as penetration flashing for a single ply EPDM roof membrane, not just to go up the penetration like we see here. So that's actually a nice segue into what resulted in 10% of the leaks that we looked at last year, which is roof penetrations. So when we're talking about roof penetrations, it is any opening in the roof deck for plumbing, electrical, HVAC, anything of that nature. So very commonly what we're seeing with the flashing at these penetrations that's leading to leak issues is corrosion occurring in the flashing, perforations either from that corrosion or from other causes, deterioration occurring at the membrane that is roofing in the penetration. And then we also have deleted penetrations that where there might have been a vent or a plumbing stack at one point that was no longer required. Therefore, the piping or ducting that was there was removed. However, the hole is still in place. And then it either wasn't sealed at all or wasn't adequately sealed and water is entering. So in this particular case, it's something that we come across very often, where on an inverted roof system, again, you can't see the membrane layer or the base of this penetration. So walking by this area, you wouldn't be able to know that anything is happening beneath the gravel here. When the area was exposed, there was some pretty severe corrosion and some pretty big perforations in the membrane, in the flashing. This one at the bottom here, you can see the water just sitting inside this penetration. So some other cases here with both high domes at plumbing stacks and B vents or tall cones at various vents with cracks and damages in the actual flashing. This is also another reason why throughout the investigation process, it is very helpful to be able to see what's happening on the underside of these penetrations. So in a setting where there is a drop ceiling or an access panel that you can see what's happening behind, or in some commercial settings where there isn't really a ceiling, it's just the area is exposed, it makes it a little bit easier. In other cases, if the drywall isn't already cut, when we get to site, we do request being able to cut the drywall ceiling so that we can investigate what's happening behind there, trace out any water staining, and just get a better idea of what's happening. One note to make about this photo here, although ultimately these penetrations throughout did have defects to the flashing where there were splits and cracks where water was entering. This is also related to improper installation. As you can see here, you can see the bottom of the flashing. You should never be able to see that. That should be underneath the membrane roofed in. Hypothetically, if this was starting to lift at all, water would be able to just enter beneath the flashing and into that opening for that penetration. So in this situation where we had a deleted vent, this leak had been going on for a number of years, and ultimately couldn't figure out what was happening. So in this situation, we did get the authorization to cut the ceiling here to figure out what was going on. When the drywall was removed on the other side of it, there was some pretty significant staining that was suspected to be mold. Also behind the ceiling, there was a lot of rust occurring and an opening found where there was once some sort of penetration there. When this was traced out to the roof surface, you can see there was a cover here that was housing something. When that was lifted up and the large concrete paving stone was lifted up, there was an old vent here that did have some sealant, but the sealant was deteriorated and the vent itself was severely rusted and corrosion was occurring down at the base. This situation is kind of tricky because since this is built into the wall, I imagine that when this was capped off and decided that it wasn't going to be used anymore, it was probably a lot more cost effective to just cover it up rather than taking it out completely. That's why when it comes to deleted vents, it's really going to be up to the building whether it's something that you remove entirely if it's something you're not going to need anymore, or just cap it off and seal it. The only thing I would say is making sure that if you are keeping the opening for the penetration there, ensuring that it is sealed watertight. And if it's a situation where it's sealed with any sort of sealant or detailer or liquid membrane, just making sure that that is reviewed over time to make sure that any of the sealant there is being kept up to date and isn't deteriorating to the point that it's going to cause any leak issues down the line. One tip for any penetrations throughout inverted or green roof surfaces, it is recommended to have these inspected on an annual basis, whether it is part of regular maintenance or its own scope of work. A lot of the times the buildings that we're accessing have a lot of penetrations throughout the roof surface, so it's not likely to be feasible to check all of them in one given time. It would take days at least, just because it is a lot of work to remove the layers of this roof system, expose the base, determine what's going on, put it all back, especially if there are any repairs that need to be required. But even if you are completing it in phases, just getting a look and determining if there are any issues happening and trying to catch some of these defects before they become so severe that there are perforations or anything else happening that's going to allow water to enter and cause an interior leak. So similar to the roof penetrations would be any drains, whether they are flat roof drains or overflow scupper drains that we commonly see on flat roof townhomes. So common issues that we see here are corrosion occurring at the drain insert or specifically at the bolts, any deteriorated membrane around where the drain is roofed in, missing or damaged blue seal that goes inside the drain insert, or lifting and damaged membrane at the scupper overflow drain. So once again, being able to see what's happening on the underside of this can be very helpful, especially when it comes to drains. There are a lot of situations where it can go either way. It can be a drain issue that's happening at roof level that requires a roof issue, or it can be a drain issue that is due to the connection and requires a plumber. So by having access to the underside here, we see that there's no water dripping from the connections. It's coming from the roof deck actively leaking. When we went and exposed that drain from the roof surface, severe corrosion occurring throughout with the drain insert and the bolts here, as well as some of the membrane around the drain. When a cut test was completed, there was found to be water present beneath the membrane, which just helps to determine that this leak is coming from this drain here. One thing that we would recommend, even if there aren't any issues specifically with the drain, whether it's the drain hardware itself or the membrane, is just making sure that drains throughout the roof surface, whether it's an inverted roof or not have been checked regularly to confirm that there aren't any blockages occurring. Very often what we see is drains being blocked by debris, vegetation, or other items, and then it's affecting the adequate flow of water through these drains and has the potential to cause flooding throughout the roof surfaces, especially in days like today where we have quite a bit of snow accumulation from yesterday. Once this snow starts to melt, if it doesn't have a place to go, if there are any defects throughout the roof surface, they will find those, get in, lead to a lot of different leak issues. Very recently, over the holidays at our head office in BC, they had a situation where, they got unlikely snowfall, quite a bit of snow accumulated, and then there was freezing and heavy snow accumulation throughout the roof surfaces, followed by a bit of a warm up and a melt that led to a record-breaking amount of leaks, where when they were accessing these roof surfaces, a lot of the drains were blocked and the roofs were flooded throughout, not allowing the water to drain properly and getting into various openings in the roof surface. So the final one that we want to look at today doesn't happen as often. It's only 4% of the overall leaks that we investigated last year, but definitely something that we wanted to highlight, especially because we tend to see it a lot more commonly this time of year during the winter months, and just because it can have very devastating impacts on interior spaces and just the overall structure of the home. So the other thing about leaks from condensation is a lot of the times, by the time it's presenting itself in the interior, the path that it's taken to get there, it has caused quite a bit of destruction along the way, whether that's through the attic, in various rooms throughout the home, or between the room and the roof deck. We have a situation here where the condensation throughout was so severe that all of the ceilings in the majority of the unit had to be removed, and there was excessive staining on the roof deck. One of the things that we see very commonly that leads to excessive condensation is disconnected vents behind the drywall ceiling or in attic spaces. So the hot air from these vents just blowing into these spaces and creating so much condensation that it leads to active leaks within the unit. So this situation that we saw, this was leaking into a bathroom of a unit. When we got up onto the roof surface, there was, even though there had been some snow recently, a lot of the areas throughout the roof surface were dry, except for this one vent here. There was some active water on the outside of the vent, whereas the other vents were dry, didn't have anything going on. When the cap was removed, the hole here from the screw first had water seeping out of it, and then when we got a look inside, all of the insulation throughout was just soaked. So that was pulled out to investigate further. Looking down, there was a disconnection here. Something else was pulled out, and again, just heavy corrosion occurring. When this particular ducting was put back in place, it was found to be too short. Ultimately, this needed to be replaced as soon as possible, and an HVAC technician was recommended just to confirm some of those interior connections as well. So some tips that can just help to identify if there might potentially be any condensation issues happening, especially when it comes to the bathroom. Completing a tissue test of the bathroom fan. There can be times where you turn the bathroom fan on and it sounds like it's working, it's making a sound, you can hear it going. But if you hold 2 pieces of toilet paper up to it and it's not holding that tissue paper up, that could mean that there's an issue with the ventilation. And if there's an issue with the ventilation, then that could mean that all that hot air from when you're having a shower isn't venting out of the roof surface, but venting into other areas above the ceiling. So another helpful tip that might help to identify any condensation issues that are occurring in an attic space, especially on a day like today or in the days following where we've just had some snow accumulation is pay attention to the overall coverage of snow on the roof surfaces. If you have units that are completely covered in snow, and then you have another one that's only partially covered, where there's snow along the bottom half, but along the top, it is completely bare. You can see all of the shingles. That could be an indication that there's an airflow issue within the attic, that it's too hot, and it's the attic heat that is melting all of this rather than the outdoor temperature, if it's only happening to the one unit. So this is something that can lead to ice damming. However, if the weather isn't cold enough following this snow accumulation, it might not get to the point where it's forming icicles below. And again, with the leaks from condensation, it might take quite a while before it's appearing inside the home and creating any staining or active leaks in an area where it's going to be noticed right away. So this is one of the most helpful ways to spot if there is an issue, and then you can get somebody in to complete an attic investigation and determine if there are any issues happening that can be corrected as soon as possible. So those, again, were all of the top items that we saw throughout the year last year. So just in conclusion, as I mentioned at the beginning, predicting leaks can be quite difficult. It's never going to be possible to predict where every leak is going to happen or eliminate them entirely. However, completing regular inspections of the roof surface or completing regular maintenance is going to be the best chance to help identify some of these issues before they happen, and best chance of stopping leaks in their tracks. So some of the specific items that we looked at that can help are addressing any missing shingles immediately as soon as they're observed, as long as it's safe to do so, renewing any caulking once it begins to deteriorate before it gets to the point that it's split and cracked, periodic inspection of the penetration bases, especially in regards to an inverted or green roof system, where those are not going to be visible by completing an overall visual inspection. Checking and clearing the roof drains to ensure that they're not going to cause any blockages, especially in periods of heavy rain or snow and ice accumulation that might indirectly lead to leak issues from flooding through the roof surfaces. And as we just saw, observing the overall snow coverage on roof surfaces to identify if there could be any attic ventilation issues, or completing a tissue test to see if there are any issues with ventilation in a bathroom space. All right, so now we are going to open up any questions. If anybody does have a question, please feel free to unmute yourself, or if you are more comfortable, please feel free to pose any questions in the chat.
Hi, Kelly.
Hi.
I have a question that was emailed to me, from a customer, just asking about temp repairs and how long we guarantee our temp repairs for when we do complete a leak investigation.
Michelle, I'll let you take that one just because I know that this comes up with you quite a lot.
Yep, no problem. One thing to keep in mind is a temporary repair is that it's meant to be temporary. Unfortunately, there is no guarantee of how long a temporary repair would last, especially during the temperature fluctuations that we get throughout winter. I mean, we get lots of days where we get 30 degrees of temperature fluctuations. That expansion and contraction of the roof is really hard on them. They're meant to stop the leak immediately and give the board time to review recommendations and get the proper repairs done. So they could last anywhere at this time of year from a couple days to a few weeks. Very rarely they last longer than that. Sometimes you can get a few months out of it. It's really, you're paying, you know, if you like to gamble, then I would leave it for a few months. If you'd like to risk getting more interior, but just complete the repair as soon as possible.
So a question that we just got in the chat was whether or not this presentation will be available by soft copy. It's absolutely something that we can send via PDF. Also, by tomorrow, we will have this uploaded onto our YouTube channel, where we do have videos of all the webinars that we have held in the past. So tomorrow morning, I will be sending out an email with the link to this particular recording, as well as anything else for anybody that wants that.
Kelly, I also received another question. So I have a question about, is it required to lift metal flashing during a leak investigation?
I
Do you want to take that one, Kelly?
Technically, it's not required, but it is highly recommended just because there's so many things that you can discover by looking underneath the metal flashing. We've seen scenarios before where there might be some defects occurring just outside of the upturn where there's something in the field membrane. But then when we lift up the metal flashing, we find that the stripping membrane doesn't go all the way up and over, or the parapet wall doesn't have, it's just plywood and no waterproofing there. So the plywood is completely wet. Water is seeping in from an exposed seam. There's just a lot to discover by just going a little further, looking a little deeper into what the issue is, and identifying any additional repairs that may be required.
Okay, I have one other question that was emailed me in, Kelly, as we have a lot of snow on roofs right now. Shouldn't they be waiting to complete any leak repairs or leak investigations until the warm spring and it's warm outside?
Again, as long as it's safe to access the roof. On a day like today, accessing a sloped shingle roof might present some challenges. However, as long as it's safe to access the roof, and as long as you're following manufacturer guidelines and technical data sheets, there isn't any issue with completing repairs throughout the winter.
The other thing we can keep in mind too, is that with sloped roofs, there's also things that we can do to divert water in the attic to limit interior damage until the roofs are safely accessible. Another option is that, we can, with leak investigations, we can do our best to stop any water ingress. If there is lots of snow and ice on the roof, we can always apply ice melt, which would temporarily increase the water, as long as we can contain it internally in a bucket. And then we would be able to return the following day to apply any temporary repairs and complete an investigation. It's important to get them done as soon as possible to prevent any long-term structural issues with the building, rusting, or like excessive interior damage. Is there any more questions in the chat? Saw some come in.
No questions, just some comments. Thank you to everybody for joining us today and for those comments in the chat. It's always appreciated when we have people come out and take part in these sessions. So I really appreciate your time today and that you enjoyed the presentation. As I mentioned, I will be sending out the email tomorrow morning that has some further information as well as a link to this presentation. And just so everybody is aware, we do have a schedule of some of our upcoming webinars that we will be offering in February and March. So on February 22nd, we will be doing a webinar that's all about attics and ice damming. After that, on March 23rd, we will be doing identifying improper repairs, just so that if there are any repairs being carried out at your building, you have a better chance of identifying if there are any issues that might potentially lead to leak issues down the line. Also, at the beginning of February, for anybody that signed up to our newsletter, we will be announcing some promotions related to attics and some services that we'll be offering throughout the month of February, since that is going to be a very popular topic with the snow and the weather right now. So stay tuned for that.
Sorry, Kelly, there is one quick question.
I was just going to say from Ronson, he asked if flat roof is a flat roof designed to drain to the roof drains or just for excessive water to flow into an open drain? And also, how long do shingles last in years and what is the best type?
So as far as the roof drains, yes, the buildings are designed to to drain or for the water to go towards the roof drains. So even in the cases of flat roofs, there is still a low slope that is going to divert the water towards the drains.
Yeah, and pretty much the one thing to keep in mind though, that ponding water is visible and normal on pretty much all flat roofs. You're going to get a little bit of ponding water just when it turns into excessive water and you're having massive drainage issues that it becomes a problem and your waterproofing system isn't good. And then the shingle lifespan, do you want to answer that, Kelly?
Yeah, I think that's going to depend on type of shingles installed, how they were installed. We don't often replace full shingles, so
It's about 15 years on average. But again, as Kelly said, there's lots of factors, whether the complex was maintained, that sort of stuff.
Caroline, in regards to signing up for our newsletter, in the email that I send out tomorrow, for anybody that isn't currently on our emailing list that wants to be added, please just let me know and we'll get you added to that so that you can stay up to date on any items that we have going on. Okay, well, if that is it for today, once again, thank you everybody so much for taking the time to join us today. Again, with the email tomorrow, it will have a recording of this webinar as well as information on February promotions and upcoming webinars. So enjoy the rest of the day and we will see you later.
Bye, thanks everybody.
Thanks, everyone.